Hello, everyone. My name is Deontay Marquis. I'm a family nurse practitioner, and today I'm going to be presenting to you on behalf of my ALF training, um, medical record documentation and legal aspects appropriate for nursing assistants. Um, so let's begin. So here you'll see, once again, we'll be talking about medical record documentation. So how to accurately document on your patients events that are normal, everyday occurrences, and also events that are abnormal, sentinel events such as patient falls and things like that. And we're also going to be talking about the legal aspects behind documentation, what we should be documenting, why we're documenting it, and how to do so appropriately and effectively to make sure that we are practicing safe. So here we have the course objectives. Outlined here are five main points that I want to touch on with you today. The first is going to be making sure that you are able to understand and provide a clear definition of HIPAA. I know a lot of you have probably heard the word, but we're going to make sure today that you understand exactly what that word means and how it applies to you in your practice. Next, we're going to work on understanding all the legal requirements for a certified nursing assistant, what's expected of you, how to meet those expectations, and what happens when those expectations aren't fully met, how to chart appropriately. We know in medicine and healthcare, things are changing every day, nothing is predictable. On our end with the care we can provide because it's based on the patient, and the patient is a person, and people we change, a lot of variables going into play. So we're going to talk about that. Third objective, I want to make sure that you guys know the key characteristics of proper documentation. Um, what are the specifics that will set your documentation apart from others, and making sure that everything that you're doing on a day-to-day basis is being charted correctly. Fourth objectives, know the daily expectations and responsibilities of the CNA. So, okay, we're going to learn about the characteristics of proper documentation, but then in order for you to document properly, you have to know what it is that is expected of you to be documented. So we're going to delve deep into that. And lastly, there are 6 patient rights that are inherent in healthcare, wherever it is you're practicing. So we're going to talk about those today, those 6 patient rights, and how to make sure we're always upholding them. Okay, so let's get started. First slide here is, I have it titled, What is HIPAA? So HIPAA, HIPAA, is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Um, so we must always make sure that what we're doing is protecting our patient's information. That is very important, just as so protecting the patient, keeping the patient safe. So what is HIPAA? What is it that I'm protecting? Well, HIPAA is also can be PHI. So PHI stands for Protected Healthcare Information, such as your patient's phone number, their address, any mail that comes to the facility for them, their social security number, their license number, their health plan beneficiary numbers, any numbers of associated family members on their chart, anything that can uniquely identify something about them is considered PHI, which we must protect because that is upholding the HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. So it's very important that you understand what is HIPAA. Therefore, we can know what it is we're trying to protect and keep hidden from other people who shouldn't have this information. So when is it okay to share this information? Who should we share it with? Well, This is rather simple. We must only share it with people whose job directly uh, requires this information for them to complete their job. So, what type of people would this be? Well, people who are involved in the treatment of the patient. Let's say your patient is getting massage therapy at a facility outside of their home where they are with you, or someone's coming in to provide this massage therapy. It's okay to share information with them, the address, the phone number, things like this. Just make sure that you're keeping note of who came and inquired about the patient, and make sure that they're providing you with some type of documentation identifying who they are. Also, payment. Let's say the insurance company from the patient went to have an x-ray and they came back to your facility. The x-ray facility calls you or calls your facility, and they want to get in from this patient's social security number or their address. Maybe they moved, and in order for the x-ray company to charge them, they need to get updated address. It's okay to provide this payment information. It's okay to provide this information for businesses who are trying to take payment, or businesses who are providing some type of treatment for your patient, or lastly, what they call operations. That's just medical teaching. That's kind of more so what you and I, me being a nurse, you being a CNA or some other type of healthcare professional, would be involved in on a day-to-day basis, medical teaching. So if I'm relieving you for your shift, it's okay for you to share the patient's private information with me. That's considered medical teaching or reporting to other personnel. Or perhaps this patient has a specific type of illness that requires a certain type of training for the CNAs in a specific facility. You got a new admit, this patient's need a specific type of care. It's okay for the charge nurse or manager to provide this special teaching and use this an identifier to identify this patient. And this last statement I have here, it is okay to share HIPAA only when the patient receives a copy of the entity's notice of privacy practices. So what I mean by entity, that's just a name for a company, or as I use in my examples, a business, a treatment business, a payment business. That's entities. So your facility is considered an entity, and it's okay to share the patient's information on behalf of that entity, as long as the patient has received a copy of the notice of privacy practices. This will keep them informed and is adhering to the patient's rights to know who and when and why their information will be shared. Handling HIPAA. So I have a scenario here for you. So I titled this slide, A Need to Know Basis. HIPAA scenario 1. I work in admitting. A friend who works in the ER told me that she just saw a famous movie star get on the elevator. My friend read in the paper that the movie star has cancer and asked me to find out what floor the star is on, because we know which floors are where cancer patients are treated. Should you give your friend this information? So that's just a quick scenario. It seems like a friend works in the ER, and she's told another nurse that she saw a famous movie star get on the elevator, and her friend works with cancer patients. So she wants to know what floor this or what room this cancer patient is going to. So this instance actually happens a lot, more so than you would think. In my medical background, I've worked at two very prestigious hospitals where famous people are known to frequently get their health care in Los Angeles. Excuse me. So this is something that was really big at these hospitals, and it's even bigger. Let's say it doesn't have to be a movie star; it could be just a friend of someone, or just someone trying to get information about a person for whatever reason. But before you share this information with just anyone, you need to ask yourself: is this information necessary for you to do your job? Why do you need this information? And if you can't reasonably answer that question, then the information doesn't need to be shared, or it's not. You don't need to inquire about it. Is this information necessary for your friend to do their job? Should you even be discussing this information with your friend in relation to their job? yes, they work at the same hospital as you, but it doesn't matter. They may work at the same facility as you. It doesn't matter. If they don't have direct dealings with this patient that would mandate that this information would be necessary for them to carry out their job, then you shouldn't be discussing it with them. Would you want strangers to have your private information? Would the patient be okay with hospital personnel outside of the unit where they are admitted to knowing their information? So, would this be okay with you if you were the patient and you knew that healthcare workers in the hospital or facility where you were staying or being treated were discussing your information, who weren't necessarily involved in your care or even working on the unit with you? So you need to make sure these are some questions you can ask yourself before discussing HIPAA with anyone else, even if they do work in the same facility as you. So, protecting HIPAA, the do's and don'ts. So you see I have two columns here, the check mark and the X mark, what you should be doing and what you should not be doing. So under the do's, verbal awareness. You should be aware of where you're talking about a patient's information, who you're talking about it to, who's around, because even if you are talking about the information to someone who is directly involved in the patient's care and does deserve, or it is appropriate for their job to finish their job to have this information, where are you talking about it with them? Is it in a public place, an elevator, in front of the building, out in the cafeteria? Um, it's not always safe, and that can still be a breach in HIPAA if someone who isn't involved in the patient's care hears this information. And you never know, that person could be a manager. So you just want to make sure that you have verbal awareness. Also, written paper, hard copy protections. What does this mean? This means that if we're writing information down, I know as I worked as a nurse, sometimes I take report on a piece of paper. I write down a lot of identifying information about the patient sometimes. I try and use abbreviations, but you can't always do that. So you want to make sure that you're taking the correct precautions to protect written paper with PHI, protected healthcare information for your patient, or hard copy protection. If you're logging into a computer, you want to make sure that you lock the computer before you leave. Safe computing skills, that's what this is talking about. Making sure that no one can see the information that you have on your screen who's standing around you. They may be trying to steal a patient's information. And if you're the one who has been accessing this information, and let's say the patient's credit card information is there and there's a strange charge on it, this could be traced back to you. Reporting suspected security incidents. Of course, as always, if you see something that's not right or something that you feel a person shouldn't be doing or shouldn't be talking about, you need to report it to your manager and let them know, hey, I have an issue to discuss with you. It relates to HIPAA protection for a patient such and such. The don'ts. So in order to make sure we ensure written paper, hard copy protections, we don't want to throw away documents in the trash. Like I said, verbal awareness. We don't want to discuss PHI in the hallway or the elevator or any public places like that. And also, we don't want to leave any personal documents in plain sight. In plain sight, if we are writing on a piece of paper and someone comes to talk to us, a family member, a coworker, anyone, just turn your paper over. Make sure that they can't see the information that's written there, or put it in your pocket, just very casually. Let's see. Okay. So, what are the residents' rights? We know that we have to protect their healthcare information, but what else is a right of this patient that we need to make sure we assume appropriate responsibility for? So, you should know, I have this statement here: residents in a long term facility, assisted living facility, and similar healthcare organizations have the same rights as patients in a hospital, no more and no less. Healthcare personnel working with patients in these types of healthcare facilities must know and be familiar with these rights and how to uphold them. So, in total, there are six. So, quality of life, quality of care, an ability to make decisions, a bill of rights, privacy, and financial status. Those are the 6 residence rights. And most of them are pretty self-explanatory, but just so you have a clear idea of what they mean, quality of life. What is quality of life? So ask yourself, what is quality of life to you? So that's what I did to define these. I asked myself, what does quality of life mean to me? And how would I explain that in a way that applied to all patients, because for every person, quality of life might mean something different. So quality of life as a resident right is increasing or sustaining the value the patient has for their life and experiences every day. So you want to make sure that you are always doing things to increase or sustain the current value that they have on their life and everyday experiences. Now, what is quality of care? That's something I'm sure you guys have heard. Quality of care is providing the patient safe, effective, loving, and consistent medical care and meaningful human interactions. That's what I believe makes up quality care, is that the patient is safe, they're being treated lovingly, meet with meaningful interactions, and this is on a consistent basis that they're getting this type of care. And of course, the last resident right here to the left is an ability to make decisions. So we want to make sure that at the end of the day, regardless of who they are, their behavior, their medical diagnosis, they have the ability to make decisions. If we disagree with those decisions, then we disagree, but they still have the right to make that decision, and we have a responsibility to carry them out, unless it is one that may harm them and there is a note from the doctor or a diagnosis which says that they aren't in the correct state of mind to have this resident right. But still, we should try and respect it as much as possible. Let's see here. What is privacy? Start at the bottom left. Privacy is not breaching HIPAA, but also protecting patient belongings. So this is something you want to make sure you make note of, because it is our responsibility when we're taking care of these patients to not only protect their information under HIPAA, but to also protect their belongings from theft, to protect their telephone calls and sustain privacy, and things of this nature. What is a Bill of Rights? This was something new to me that I learned about recently, is that patients staying in a short-term or long-term care facility, they have a right to be given a Bill of Rights, which is basically a pamphlet which discusses specific rules, sometimes specific to the facility, but in general, lets them know that here, under the care of these caregivers, they won't be discriminated against. They have a right to their human dignity, to be treated respectfully, and the caregiver can't give or accept personal gifts for the expected level of care uh, that the patient will be receiving. That last line was really interesting to me. I feel like the Bill of Rights is set to just say, hey, everyone's going to be treated fair here. Our caregivers can't accept gifts for the care that they're providing to you. And we do this because it maintains a level of integrity that if I give the nurse coming on shift some of my pastries from home, I know that they'll take me on an extra walk. So it just eliminates that type of favoritism, and lets every patient know that, hey, we're doing the best we can to care for all of you guys, and there's nothing that you can do to make us treat you any better or treat you any less. So they get a Bill of Rights. Lastly, the last 6 resident right is financial status. Patients have the right to know about their finances while they are in the facility. They have a right to know about how much they were charged for any procedure, any test. They have a right to see their bills. They have a right to have a copy of their bills. They have a right to know how much insurance is contributing toward their stay or a medication or anything like that. They have the right to know. It's their account, it's their financial status, And if they ask us about it, we say, I'm not sure, but I'd be glad to get you a copy and let you know if you would like. And if so, we get the copy of their financial status. We make sure that the PHI, their health information, is all protected when we're sharing this information with them. And we make sure that they have this copy and they either store it somewhere where it will continue to stay safe from anyone taking their PHI, or we dispose of it appropriately, because remember, we can't throw away paper documents in the trash, because that still leaves them exposure to a HIPAA breach. So now let's get into specific legal obligations of a CNA. So what are your legal obligations? The scope of practice for a CNA, you know very well what is required of you. You have to assist with meals, educate and take care of topics in regard to nutrition, making sure the patient is having a balanced diet, they're staying hydrated, they're drinking enough of the right things, not too much soda, just enough water, different methods of care. It is within your scope of practice to know different methods of care, to execute them, to take care of a long-term patient or one who's terminally ill. Of course, everyday expectations, vital signs, which include blood pressure, temperature, respiration, those types of vital signs. Also, a big legal obligation for CNAs that I want you guys to really be cognizant of is you need to be able to recognize dangers within your patient's environment, within their room, within the hallways, within the living area where they're spending the majority of their time, because you need to be aware of any risk for falls, any dangers. Is the floor wet today? Is there a leak coming from the ceiling? We need to be aware of these things because these patients are under our care. We're responsible for them. So we need to know if there's a danger. We need to know, is this patient laying on this side of their back too much? We need to turn them because we need to make sure they don't develop an ulcer. Is there a cut on their leg that we need to clean that they have been neglecting? And we notice while we help them get dressed one day, it looks like it might be getting infected, or we need to catch it before it shows signs of infection. We need to recognize these types of dangers before they present. And lastly, notifying a supervisor when any complications arise, anything regarding the patient's health. If there's an abnormal vital sign, if the patient's mentally, there's a mental change and we're concerned about the patient, have they had a stroke? If the patient hasn't been eating, or if the patient hasn't been regularly using the bathroom, we need to be aware of the abnormals for our patients so we can know what to report. And that's some legal obligations of the CNA, of the job requirements that you all need to be aware of and need to be okay to execute effectively. Last but not least, I include this statement here because there is one last legal obligation of CNAs, and that is to assist the registered nurse as they see, and also to do so in a timely fashion. Now, I bolded all tasks that have been assigned by an RN, and I also bolded the word timely. Now, this is something timely specifically is an objective word to me. So when a nurse delegates a task to you, you want to make sure you do it in a timely fashion. But that timely fashion has to be realistic for the job list that you already have of things you're doing for yourself or for another patient or for another nurse. And it needs to also be timely to the nurse because we don't know the urgency with which they need the task done. So we need to make sure when a nurse assigns us a task that we get clarification on how soon, what is timely to you right now? Is this something that needs to be done right now? Is this something that I can do right now? And we need to make sure that they understand, yes, we can complete this right now, or no, we are unable to complete this at this time in the fashion that you need. So That is very important. CNA legal obligations. What am I accountable for? This is a big thing. So we just talked about the requirements. Now we need to know, what are the obligations? What are you accountable for if something goes wrong? So as a CNA, you can be held legally accountable for mistreating or abusing the patients, which is something we all shouldn't be doing anyway. But it doesn't necessarily have to be physical abuse. Mistreating or abusing the patient can also mean that we just simply weren't taking care of the patient, or as I said on the last slide, recognizing those dangers, which can be considered a form of abuse. If the patient develops a severe skin ulcer, or skin breakdown, that can be considered neglect, which leads us into the second point, neglecting to do parts of the job. That can be considered neglect, and some people may even argue that as forms of abuse. Abandoning the patient in a need of care. We can't leave the patient, even if we have something serious going on in our personal life at home. We can't leave to go tend to. We can't leave the patient to go tend to that. You need to let your manager know. You need to let another coworker know, and make sure that your job responsibilities are covered and that your patient is taken care of in your absence from the job. Acting inappropriately or unprofessionally, this can affect the patient's health, mental or physical. And this can be another aspect of the job we can legally be held accountable for. Giving poor care that is below the standard of care for your state. So this is very important. Lastly, not respecting the patient's privacy rights and violating confidentiality. We spent several slides just a minute ago talking about why it's important to protect HIPAA, why it's important to know the sick patient rights, because we have to uphold them. But why? Well, because we are accountable for them to make sure that they're upheld while these patients are in our care. So the big question you probably have here, well, how do I stay inside the legal lane? And you see I have the cars there with the yellow car staying inside the lane, and the other two cars look like they're getting ready to swerve into the lane or out of their legal lane. So how do we do this? Number one, you need to know the policy and procedures at your specific facility. This will help serve as a guide for you to manage your day-to-day activities, to know what the expectations of you are relative to the patient population that you're taking care of. And you also need to adhere to the HIPAA rules and guidelines, which, as we talked about, are very simple. Protecting PHI, patient healthcare information. We talked about the ways to protect our patient's healthcare information by not discussing PHI in open or public areas, and also maintaining computer safety, making sure we log off our computer, making sure if anyone is standing behind us that they can't see our information, and also not throwing away pieces of paper or hard documentation with PHI on it in the trash can. And last, how to stay inside the legal lane. Proper documentation, very important. So in order to properly document, we need to know what it is we need to be charting. So some common duties of the CNA, it says can, supposed to say CNA, which should be documented, are the patient's level of consciousness, the patient's vital signs, fluid intake, urinary output, bowel activity, oral intake, color and skin turgor, the patient's behavior, information, weight, and activity level. And you see next to each of those points, I have a question, which is which would lead you to document correctly what it is under this topic that the chart needs to be filled with. So so for example, when we're documenting the patient's vital sign, you don't say patient's vital signs are stable. You chart their blood pressure, their temperature, their pulse, their respiratory rate. You paint a clear and factual picture that their vital signs are stable. The patient's level of consciousness. Um, are they alert? Are they confused? If they are confused, what are they confused about? Are they confused about the day of the week, the month, the year, where they are, who they are their sickness? So what's going on? What are they confused about? What is the level of consciousness? So pay attention to make sure you not only chart under these topics, but you also answer the questions associated with them correctly to make sure that the chart has the correct information, to paint a clear picture for anyone looking at the chart after you who wasn't taking care of the patient. Let's see, proper documentation for the CNA. So here is a very long, I do apologize about that paragraph here, but it's a scenario. It's a sample documentation of a nurse's document about a patient situation. And then on the next slide, I'm going to show you how we can revise this document and still keep the meat of the information that we need to properly document, because this document from the nurse has too much information. So I'll give you a moment and let you read this, and then I'll read along with you. And then we'll go to the next slide and figure out what is in this document that isn't needed, that can be taken out. So I'll give you a minute now. Okay, so should have had enough time to finish reading. I'm going to read with you. So in this chart, the nurse wrote, I entered the patient's room at 1300 hours and advised him I was going to perform catheter care. I removed the bedding and lifted the patient's gown in order to expose the area. I examined the meatus and the skin around the area. I did not observe any redness, swelling, or drainage. I checked all of the other catheter connections and ensured that the catheter was firmly secured to the patient's leg and that there was no tension on the catheter tube that would affect or irritate its insertion site. The urinary collection bag was secured to the bed with 2 hooks, and it was approximately 12 to 14 inches below the level of the bladder. There were no kinks or loops in the collection tube. The urine color was pale yellow. I did not observe any blood or sediment in the tube or the bag. I washed my hands using soap and water, scrubbing for 2 minutes. I dried with paper towel and then put on disposable gloves. I washed the area around the insertion site of the catheter with soap and water and a gauze pad, moving from the inside cnazone.com, that's where I got the information from, to 5 outside a circular manner. This took appropriately 2 minutes, and the patient did not complain of pain or discomfort during the procedure. After discarding the gauze and the disposable gloves in a hazardous waste container, I repositioned the gown, replaced the bedding, and made sure the patient's call light could be reached. The procedure was completed at 13:10. Well, this is an extremely thorough documentation by the CNA. She tells us how the patient's area looked before she cleaned, after she made sure she included that she charted her hand washing. She charted that she cleaned the area. She charted to make sure that the chart showed the collection bag was lifted off of the ground and it was below the bladder. There were no kinks in the tube, the color of the urine. She or he charted everything. But there is a way to chart everything, but not chart too much. So This is the revised, more appropriate documentation of what we just read on the previous slide. So let's read it here together. Catheter care was performed at 1300 hours. The patient tolerated the procedure well. No abnormalities were noted at the catheter insertion site. Nothing abnormal was noted in the urine, and all parts of the system were properly positioned. The patient's call light was left within reach. So, what changed? How can both of those still be considered appropriate documentation, but one is almost a fourth of the length of the other? Well, first, step-by-step detail, as the first charting showed us, isn't needed because the CNA has already been delegated the task of cleaning the catheter insertion site and repositioning. So we can reasonably assume that the CNA has the experience to do the procedure, so they don't need to walk us through their step-by-step details of what they did. That isn't necessary. It's been delegated to them. They have the training. We can assume that they did it correctly. Hand washing, proper disposal of waste, and similar task documentation is not needed. Now, the only part of this statement that I want to make sure you at your specific facility discuss with your manager about documenting is hand washing. I've worked at some facilities and they do want you to document that you washed your hands. I worked at some where they were indifferent. And then here in creating this presentation for you guys, I also found some resources that said they do want you to document hand washing and some that said they don't. So I always say that we do until we are told don't. So we're going to say that we will chart hand washing, but ask your manager, what are their thoughts? What is the facility's opinion on charting hand washing? Proper disposal of waste. I would make sure I properly dispose of waste if the patient has been treated with any type of chemotherapeutic agents. Then you want to make sure. But for these types of patients, in my experience, the registered nurse, is responsible for disposing of the waste, not the CNA. But if in your facility this is different, then again, this is another piece of the documentation that I want you to ask your manager or facility. Should I be documenting that I properly disposed of the waste, or is it assumed because I have the training and knowledge how to properly do so that I have done this correctly and I don't need to include it in my chart? So that's it. So the step-by-step detail isn't needed. Hand washing, disposing, similar tasks, how she cleaned the area, that's not needed. Naming specific anatomy parts, no. All she or he needs to say is the catheter insertion site, nothing abnormal noted. Assessed catheter insertion site, nothing abnormal noted. Last point here, when a CNA is documenting patient care, he or she must simply keep in mind the reason for why documentation is being done. So why are we documenting that we perform catheter care? Well, because we know that if we don't perform catheter care and the catheter sits there, then that is how germs are introduced into the patient's bladder, which can lead to UTI. So that is why we're doing catheter care, and we're also making sure we're doing our rounds on this medical device to make sure that it's functioning properly, it's clean, it's intact, and there isn't anything abnormal. And that's it. So when a CNA is documenting patient care, he or she must simply keep in mind the reason for why documentation is being done, and should therefore not need to be burdened by the concern of not documented, not done. That's a phrase that was taught to me when I was first beginning as a nurse. If it's not documented, it's not done, which led me to over-document a lot until I picked up that regimen or that mantra that you ask yourself before you document, Why is it necessary for me to document that I did that procedure? And you basically talk yourself through the note. Why did I have to document that I did catheter care? Oh, because they want us to make sure we're preventing infection and we're making sure nothing is wrong with the catheter. So that is why. So in continuation, proper documentation for the CNA. The information document in a patient's chart should be timely. It should be accurate, objective, and specific. So use the acronym FACT. I'll talk to you about what FACT means. One of the most common errors in documenting is stating value judgments and not facts. The patient ate well. The patient slept well. What does well mean? Well to me means 12 hours because I love to sleep. But well for someone else might mean 6. They just need a little bit of shut eye and then they're ready. Yes, I slept well. So you see how we want to steer away from using these value judgments and not fact. Also, we want to be accurate information. We want to make sure that if we took the patient's blood pressure and it was low, that we don't just chart the patient's blood pressure was low. We want to chart exactly what it was. You want to copy those numbers from the blood pressure machine into our chart. We want to be very specific and we want to be timely with our reporting. Timely being if it occurred 10 minutes ago, we have it written down and we have the exact time. And if we're not able to chart it in a relative time to when the actual event occurred, then we know we already wrote down the time that the event occurred. And when we go to chart, we make note. Even though we're charting that we did a catheter care at 2 o'clock, we make note that the catheter care actually took place at 1 o'clock, but we were unable to chart it at that time. So that's being timely, that's being accurate, objective, and specific. So to remember how to properly document, you want to remember the acronym FACT, because anything that we're putting in our chart, we want it to be a fact. So the F in FACT is for factual. That is anything you hear or see or collect with your senses. You want to describe. So if a patient's angry, you describe patient throwing, yelling, screaming, swinging. You don't want to say a patient was very angry because then anyone can define what angry looks like to them. But you need to be very specific in your documentation and paint the picture for everyone who was not there of what happened and what you saw. You want to use neutral language and you want to avoid being biased towards a situation. A is much more simple than F in our acronym FACT, and it stands for accurate. You just want to be accurate. You want to give facts to your documentation. You want to be precise. You want to state specific amounts. I emptied the Foley catheter a large amount. No. You want to say I emptied the Foley catheter and measured exactly 247 milliliters of urine in the patient's drainage bag. And you want to note the time, not in the afternoon. You want to say 12:35 p.m. So the C in FACT is for complete. We want to make sure, of course, anything that we're putting in the chart is a complete thought. It's a complete event and time, and all details are there. We want to make sure that any space in the chart or the document or flow sheet that we use N/A to fill any blanks that aren't applicable to the situation that we're documenting. So because when you're documenting, sometimes the flow sheet on whichever computer system your facility uses, it may have things in there. For instance, let's say the patient only urinated today. There was no bowel movement. You want to make sure that if there isn't a selection of no bowel movement, that you chart NA or you put a 0 there, just so whoever comes to the chart behind you knows that you did acknowledge that the chart required urine the chart required information for both urine and bowel, and you charted that the patient voided 230 milliliters of urine, and you also charted that no, the patient did not have a bowel movement. Even if there is no space for no, you want to make sure you put NA or some kind of space filler, just to show that your chart is complete. Every blank has a response. And last but not least, T is for timely. So we talked about what timely means, simply making sure your chart or whatever action or event that occurred, that you chart it in a timely fashion. And if you're charting for something that occurred longer than 30 minutes or an hour ago, then you write down the exact time on your notebook. And when you have a chance to sit down and chart it formally, that you have the exact time the event occurred. So what do we do if we're charting an adverse event? Something went wrong. You want to be sure that you include several things. The condition change of the patient, how were they before this adverse event, and how are they now after the adverse event? The patient's response, what did they say? If they made a specific remark, you can put it in quotation and then type exactly what it is the patient said. If there was family there, do the same with the family. Who did you tell that this event occurred? Did you tell a supervisor, a manager, another CNA, another nurse? Who was there? You want to put all this information in your documentation if there's an adverse event. And then I'll put here again on the other side of the slide, do not use value judgments. If you think the patient broke their arm, don't put broke arm. Put the patient fell, the patient said, oh, I think I broke my arm, open, close quotations. But don't put that in your chart. That is considered a value judgment. Or the patient appears to be okay. Don't put that. Just put no injuries, no obvious injuries noted, no bruises noted, no scrapes, no bleeding, that type of thing. Continuing with charting on unusual or adverse events, do not include your personal assumptions of what might have occurred or contributed to the event. We just talked about that. Don't put what you think might have occurred. Remember our acronym FACT. We're only putting facts in the documentation. FACT. Include the following information: your observation. What did you do? How did you respond? Did you immediately help the patient up? Did you ask the family member to watch the patient while you and they got help? Did you take the patient's blood pressure? Did you have to shake them for them to open their eyes? What did you do? And at the bottom of this slide, I have an important note. It says, an unusual event should also be documented separately in an incident report. So a patient fall is an unusual event. If the patient fell, you should document this in their chart, and also you should file out an incident report, because this is indeed an incident. And what exactly is an incident report? And we see we have our gentleman here, he's fallen, and this is a caregiver here. She's checking on, looks like she's checking his pulse or trying to wake him up and make sure he's okay. So she's going to chart that. Noted that Mr. Johnson fell, rushed over to his side to help him, checked his pulse. Pulse rate was 82. Asked him if he was okay. He said, open close quotations, yes, I've fallen. I need some help. So an incident report is not a part of the patient's medical record. It's more so for the internal facility, wherever it is, facility you're working, to use, and is not referred to in the patient's record. Now, this is something, again, a piece of the documentation puzzle that I want you to ask your manager. If an unusual event occurs and we make a note, when we make our note, do you want us to reference that we also have created an incident report in our patient's medical chart documentation? Is this something you want us to do or you want us to avoid? Avoid laying the blame in your incident report. Don't say it was the patient's fault. Don't say it was the janitor's fault because he didn't put up a wet caution sign. Some patients create incidents by their own actions. Don't blame the patient. Um, and another note here at the bottom of this slide, do not indicate that you completed an incident report or notified the risk management department. The incident report should never be referred to in the patient's record. Again, this is just in my personal experience. Some hospitals do, some hospitals don't. So please check with your manager. Ask them, do you want us to reference an incident report if an incident occurs inside of our daily patient charting? All done. That's it. So you have 3 things to talk to your manager about. But before we get into a review of everything you learned today, I have 2 questions for you just to test your knowledge. So first question, which of the following is not one of the 6 resident rights? Now there are only 5 here. Is it A, quality of life, B, privacy, C, financial status, D, Bill of Rights, or E, choice of caregiver? Which one of these is not one of the 6 resident rights? We know quality of life is financial status, privacy, Bill of Rights, but choice of caregiver, that's the one. Choice of caregiver is not one of the 6 resident rights. Now, this may have been confusing because you're a patient. We do want to give them quality of life. And for some patients, quality of life may be making their own decisions. But having their choice of caregiver is not a right. It's something that we try to give them if there is a caregiver that they prefer or don't prefer, but it is not a resident right. Second review question, apologize. As a CNA, you can be held legally responsible for which of the following? Select all that apply. Is it a missing set of vital signs, a patient falling on the way to the bathroom after calls for help were neglected, a patient developing a new pressure sore, or a patient receiving the wrong medication? And remember, this is select all that apply. So for this, we have to think about what are a CNA's responsibilities. They are responsible for vital signs. So yes, there was a patient falling on the way to the bathroom. Remember, we talked about being responsible for noting if your patient's environment posed any type of danger. So yes, the CNA would be responsible for this if the patient fell. We also talked about neglect. So this A and B, those 2 so far are definitely things that the CNA would be legally held responsible for. The patient developing a new pressure sore, we talked about this as well. The CNA has to note those dangerous events. If the patient isn't turning correctly or they're favoring one side when they're asleep and they develop a new pressure sore, the CNA would be legally responsible for this. Last, the patient receiving the wrong medication. Now this would not be the CNA's responsibility. This is the registered nurse's responsibility. And if the patient received the wrong medication, the registered nurse is the person who should be handling the medication last and is the last line of defense. So A, B, and C would be all instances that legally the CNA would be held responsible for. All right, so we're at the lesson summary, the end of the course. If you remember, our objectives for today were to be able to define and understand HIPAA, which we can do. And we know that HIPAA is the patient's healthcare information, such as phone number, social security, address, all of the unique identifiers that can identify the patient. There's specific information that we are responsible for protecting. So we met that. Our next objective was to understand the legal requirements for certified nursing assistants. So we discussed that CNAs are responsible for assisting with meals, obtaining vital signs, recognizing dangers in the living environment, the room or the bathroom, or things that could put the patient at risk for falls, a skin infection or an ulcer. We have to keep the patient safe and we have to protect them and their healthcare information. Our third objective was knowing the key characteristics of proper documentation. And I made this one very simple, even though we covered a lot of information in slides. It was FACT, F-A-C-T. And if you don't know what those letters stand for, you need to go back, rewatch this video, and you should know FACT. Lesson summary, last slide. You should know and understand the 6 patient rights. 6 patient rights. What are they? Quality of life, quality of care, an ability to make decisions, a bill of rights, privacy, and financial status. These are our 6 patients' rights that we are responsible for upholding. And we talked about how to do so, what they are, and how to manage this inside of your facility. So, in the end, we're done for today. I want to thank you. My name is Deontay Markey. I'm a family nurse practitioner. And it was my pleasure presenting to you today on behalf of myalftraining.com. Thank you. See you next time.